not able to be here in this part of the diocese or even in our own part of the country are able to watch this. As I said at the beginning, the lecture series here was conceived as an effort to try and help fulfill what Pope Emeritus Benedict asked us to do for this year, which was to enter into a year of faith, to find that means to sort of awaken once again that tremendous fervor that should be so characteristic of our Catholic faith, to arouse in us again that pride, that love of the meeting in the person of Jesus Christ through our Catholic faith. That's what this is all about. And in a particular way, the Holy Father, among other things, asked us to do several things. One of them we're doing outside, and I'm particularly grateful. He asked that this year have a particular witness of charity. And we've done this associated with the different talks so far, and I know that there is the collection going on for the articles, the hygiene articles and so on, as a part of the collection. This is, too, a small token example of what the Holy Father has asked us to do in the course of this year of faith, that we witness again in charity to what it is we are, to be the hands of Christ. The centerpiece of what the Holy Father asked of us was that we should have a closer relationship to the Second Vatican Council. He asked us to use this year to read the documents of the Second Vatican Council. And so this lecture series, with speakers coming in with expertise in the particular areas, is intended to try and fill in as well behind some of the efforts being made in many of our parishes with the adult education, where even our pastors and our priests are sitting down and helping us to go through some of the documents and reacquaint ourselves, or maybe acquaint ourselves for the first time. You know, so many Catholics, when they got to Vatican II, they saw this book that was so large and they got a little intimidated by it. Or maybe it's something that they read early on and didn't come back to. So here's an opportunity for us to break that open again, to come back into it. We began with a talk by Bishop Arthur Kennedy from Boston, which attempted to set the circumstances for the Second Vatican Council. First called in 1958, convened in 1962. What were the historical circumstances? What led up to it? What was the reasoning, the thought behind the effort of Pope John XXIII to convene the council? The second talk was several weeks ago by Bishop William Murphy of Rockford Center, basically Long Island now in New York. And he presented to us one of the great constitutions, Lumen Gentium, Christ the Light of the World. And arguably, and a point that he made, it is the document that allows us to interpret, to understand the rest of the documents in the Second Vatican Council, because it is the document on the Church herself. What is our self-understanding as members of the Church? Once having that, we can then go through the other documents from that perspective and see and read and understand the different aspects. Today, we are going to be engaged in another of the great constitutions, Lumen Gentium, the Church in the modern world. Pope Emeritus Benedict made a strong point throughout his pontificate of 8 years to talk about the Second Vatican Council. And one of the points that he made was that one of the great questions for calling the Second Vatican Council was to say, how is the Church going to meet the changes of this new and modern and evolving world that you and I are now so much in the midst of? He was coming from his own historical perspective, well studied, as well as his lived perspective. As you know, he came out of Germany at the time of National Socialism, the Nazis, the Second World War, the catastrophe of the destruction and the suffering that he saw and that he lived through. And his own feeling and explanation of one of the great issues was not that we are to change the faith. We're never to do that. It's always the faith of Christ. But how is that faith to be re-articulated for our time in a way that will be understood and received and loved by the era that we're in? You know, we're in a time now of iPads and iPhones and all kinds of things. To speak of the faith in the same way that we did 50 years ago is to be behind the times. And so the whole question of the church engaging the modern world is such an important task. For that reason, I've asked and invited, and I'm very privileged to have Ms. Nancy Wisdo come and speak to us about Gaudium et Spes, about the church in the modern world, and about that document. Nancy has a tremendous background in the life of the church, in love for the church, in service to the church. She's a native of Pennsylvania, the Diocese of Harrisburg. She did her educational background work in sociology and in social work, and following that spent 15 years at Catholic Charities, beginning as a caseworker and concluding that service as an assistant director. She also led the pro-life, the family life, and the social justice efforts for the Diocese of Harrisburg. She was named, at a certain point, a member of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development's National Committee, and went on then to become the Director of Domestic Policy for the bishops in the United States. That's a very short term for a job with a tremendous amount of responsibilities. She was recognized and then appointed to a term on the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace in Rome. In 2005, she became the Associate General Secretary and directed the conference's public policy, domestic and government relations efforts. In a particular way, she was very much involved in the efforts to work with and defend the Church's freedom of religion, and also particularly for the tremendous work that the bishops did at the time of the passage of the current health care bill. She did a tremendous amount of work on behalf of the bishops, lobbying for, working for some of the changes that in the end we were not successful in getting. But behind that scene is a whole degree of love for the church, of experience, of work, and of effort. In 2006, she completed studies for a degree in canon law at the Catholic University, which means, yes, she's a canon lawyer as well. She retired from the Bishops' Conference last year, and I'm very pleased that we have someone of this range of experience, and particularly of faith, to address us this evening. Nancy.
Thank you very much, Bishop, for that generous introduction. You can see from what Bishop Malloy said that I used to be somebody, and now I'm not. Now I'm retired. But I'm very, very happy to be here this evening, and I'm just setting this. I'm going to time myself so that I don't go over your time. First, I want to express my thanks to you all for coming this evening. What an interesting time to be with a group of Catholics reflecting on our teaching. Yesterday I arrived in Chicago just when the white smoke came from the Sistine Chapel. And Monsignor Nelson and I were texting each other back and forth because he picked me up. And I was in the jetway waiting for my luggage to come off one of those really small planes, which are a little scary. But anyway, I'm just ready to get my luggage, and he texts me and says, "White smoke." So I announced to everybody in the jetway, "White smoke," and there were actually a number of people that were interested. And then as I walked through the airport, travelers were just riveted to the TV monitors, waiting for the announcement of a new pope. I, of course, was caught up in the moment with everybody else. But I have to confess to you that I was also relieved that the announcement was yesterday and not today. Because I could imagine all of you would be home in front of your TV watching the new pope, and certainly that's where I would want to be. Bishop Malloy was my boss at the Bishops' Conference, but he was also my sounding board when things looked really bleak, which, if I recall, was about every other day. I would go into his office and say, "I don't need advice, I just need to vent, and he would listen patiently to my list of woes. Together we survived the reorganization of the Bishops' Conference, strategic planning, and we almost survived healthcare reform. And then we both left, and I wonder if those things might be related, because they were some pretty rough times. During the healthcare debate, having him support me was my salvation. And now that I've retired, we still commiserate, but mostly now about our mutual frustrations with golf and politics. I wish I could tell you some funny stories about Bishop Malloy, but for that you're going to have to see his mother. He actually has funny stories about me, but fortunately he didn't tell any of those. We were lucky enough to have him as Associate General Secretary and then Secretary of the General Secretary of the Conference. Now when you work at the Bishops' Conference, you usually say that you have 300 bosses. But when you're General Secretary, you're particularly responsible to the President of the Conference, who in Bishop Malloy's time was Cardinal George. So it's a good thing you didn't burn any of those bridges, because you're right back there. I have no particular expertise on Vatican II, I should tell you. The closest I came was I had a course in ecclesiology in my canon law studies with a focus on the council taught by Father Joseph Kamanchak, who actually is an expert in Vatican II, and co-wrote the definitive work on the council. So when Bishop Malloy asked me to do this about 6 months ago, I thought, why is he asking me? But when someone asks you to do something 6 months in advance, you usually say, well, sure, and then you worry about it later. So I was actually feeling pretty good about this until I reviewed the previous speaker on your website, Bishop Murphy, whom I know really well. In his introduction, Bishop Murphy noted that he was a seminarian in Rome at the time of the council. So I said to myself, okay, Bishop Murphy was at the Second Vatican Council trying to get into a session, and I was trying to find my first period Spanish class in high school. Bishop Malloy, what were you thinking? But then as I thought about it more, I realized that I could bring something to this topic. I could bring the practical experience of having had to try to make the hopes and dreams of the Council Fathers on the social doctrine become reality in a very imperfect world with imperfect tools, not to mention the fact that I was a layperson working in the church. Those of us who've had the privilege of working for the church at any level are part of the legacy of the council and its opening up of the church to the laity. And that is also true of lay people in general, those of you who have leadership positions in the church, as well as those of you who volunteer every day in the parishes and dioceses. As the decree on the apostolate of the laity said, lay people too, sharing in the priestly, prophetical, and kingly office of Christ, play their part in the mission of the whole people of God in the church and in the world. So I will be relying on the work of Father Kamanchak and others who have analyzed the council documents, and in particular, GAUDIUM and SPES. My goal this evening really is to lay the groundwork for the discussion that follows this talk, and hopefully to entice you to read GAUDIUM and SPES if you haven't done it yet. I learned in my research for this talk that the message of GAUDIUM and SPES continues to be debated at various anniversaries over the past almost 50 years in seminars and series like the ones you are attending. Much of that debate is about whether the Council Fathers were too optimistic about the condition of the world and the ability of the Church to have influence over the culture. Others say they were overly cautious. I will touch on these themes later in my presentation. I'm going to divide my talk into 4 equal parts. And I don't take, by the way, I don't take any credit for this PowerPoint. My PowerPoint was pathetic looking, and then the people at the diocese fixed it up and made it look nice. First, I'm going to briefly outline how GAUDIUM and SPES came about and what were some of its unique features. Then I'll focus on the key ideas and themes of the document. In a sense, I will summarize it for you. Third, I'll discuss some of the ways the Universal Church responded to the call of that document for engagement with society. And finally, I will identify some concerns and challenges from my experience, not things that are necessarily original to me, but things that I have observed over the years. So how did the bishops prepare for the council? And a little bit on the historical context of the time. In a 2002 interview with Just Good Company, Father Kamanchak described the preparation as, quote, unprecedented in its outreach to bishops around the world for their input as to themes and advice. Questionnaires were sent to every bishop, and in response, 9,000 proposals were submitted. Now, while there was no preparatory work for GAUDIUM and SPES, as you'll see later, There were 10 preparatory commissions appointed to prepare the other documents. So even in its preparation, the desire of Pope John XXIII that this council would not be business as usual was very apparent. Again from Father Kamanchik in a 1990 article in Commonweal magazine, which commemorated the 25th anniversary of the council. He recalled how the bishops of the United States at the time of the council responded to the call for input. His analysis of their responses and the process says a lot about their expectations and how prepared they were for a very different experience. Generally speaking, the bishops of the world responded in significant numbers. Over 85% of them sent in input. In the US, it was 86, so right about the same. Not surprisingly for the time, the US bishops did not make any effort to collaborate on their responses, even though they had the opportunity to do that at their 1959 and 1960 national meetings. Surprisingly, none of the bishops of the southwestern states focused on the growth of Mexican Americans in their responses. In fact, close to 2/3 of the bishops didn't mention any issues of economic, social, political, or cultural significance. Obviously, these topics were not on their minds as they prepared for a Vatican Council, because that was not their experience of Vatican Councils of the past. Father Kamanchik goes on to describe 3 overarching areas of concern in the United States at the time: church-state relations, race, and the fear of communism. He notes that less than 1/4 of the bishops identified church-state relations or religious freedom as a concern. Now, when you realize that a major work on religious liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, emerged from the council, you get a sense of how much development happened in the course of the council process. Secondly, the issue of segregated schools was a major topic of both within the church and the nation as a whole. In 1956, the Bishop of New Orleans, Francis Rommel, declared segregation to be morally wrong, and in 1958, the bishops as a whole condemned segregation in all its forms. However, less than 10% of the US bishops mentioned race. And finally, while the country as a whole was focused on the threat of communism, having just come through the McCarthy hearings, only 20 bishops mentioned communism as a concern. I don't think these statistics show a lack of awareness of cultural and socio-economic conditions on the part of the bishops. Rather, I think it reflected their lack of understanding about just how different this council would be. They may have heard Pope John XXIII say that he was throwing open the doors and windows of the church and calling for aggiornamento, or bringing up to date, but they didn't yet know what that meant. They would soon find out in GAUDIUM et SPES that there would be a new relationship called for between the church and the modern world, one that focused on more on opportunities than on the threats of the world. Even before the debates over the content of GAUDIUM et SPES began, it was already a different document from its inception. It was an unusual document in an unusual council. First, the unusual council. Prior to this one, councils usually were called to address a particular concern or a problem in the church, sometimes a heresy, or to announce a new dogma. So when Pope John XXIII said he wanted to call a council without a specific agenda, that must have come as a surprise to some of the bishops, and some maybe even felt a little uneasy about what he had in mind, like maybe this was going to be a free-for-all. So the council itself was out of the ordinary. Then with respect to GAUDIUM et SPES, there were also some unique aspects. I read a speech that was given last year by Dr. Fajol of the University of St. Thomas. His talk was called The Battle Over GAUDIUM et SPES, Then and Now, Dialogue with the Modern World After Vatican II. He described some of the ways that you'll see up on the screen that GAUDIUM et SPES was different from the other Vatican documents. I took his list and I added some others from my research, and I came up with this list. First, it was a pastoral constitution, not a doctrinal constitution, and that difference influenced the content and the tone of the document. It was the longest document that came out of the council. If you check it on the Vatican website, it's almost 37,000 words. It was also the final document produced by the council. It wasn't completed until January 1965, and then it was even redrafted before it was finally promulgated at the end of that year. The document evolved from the floor of the council. As I said before, there was no draft prior to the